One of the questions I get asked the most frequently is whether cannabis helps reduce fibromyalgia pain. While anecdotally, there are a lot of reports of it being helpful, up until recently, we really didn't have the research data to back that up. But as legal restrictions change and shift, we are certainly seeing a lot more research being done. And in this video, I'm excited to share with you a couple of the most recent published studies that answer that question. Does cannabis help reduce fibromyalgia pain? Make sure to stay tuned till the end. I'll share with you my favorite quote from medical authority comedian John Oliver and what his take on medical marijuana is. Hi, I'm Dr. Ginevra. I'm a physician with fibromyalgia myself. I am on a mission to share the empowering and inspirational knowledge people with fibromyalgia need to defeat this illness. I call this being fibro-fierce. And in that spirit, let's dive into the science of cannabis for fibromyalgia. Any conversation around cannabis for fibromyalgia pain really needs to start by taking a little step back and just looking at how cannabis and compounds derived from the cannabis plant interact with the human body in ways that it can reduce pain. So we'll start with a little review of the endocannabinoid system, and then I'll talk about what the studies show as far as is cannabis effective for reducing fibromyalgia pain. Spoiler alert, yes, it is, but stay tuned because I think you'll find the studies pretty interesting. One quick thing before we go forward, little terminology thing. Marijuana, not really a favored term anymore. It's kind of a slang term and has some negative historical and legal connotations. So the preferred term is just to call cannabis by its scientific name, which is cannabis. And when you're talking about it in a medical context, we usually say medical cannabis. So why does cannabis have medical effects on us? Why does the cannabis plant affect the human body at all? Well, it's because we actually naturally make chemicals that are very similar to what the cannabis plant makes. So in our brain, we have what are called endocannabinoids, and those are our own chemicals that our brain makes. And because we make those chemicals, we have receptors for those compounds. So because we have cannabinoid receptors, that means that when we ingest a cannabinoid from cannabis, also called a phytocannabinoid or plant-derived cannabinoid, we actually have a ready-made receptor that phytocannabinoid can interact with, and that's how it actually gives effect, causes medicinal or other effects in the human body, is that interaction between the cannabinoid and the cannabinoid receptor. You might be more familiar with this in the terminology of the endorphin system. So endorphins are the opioids that our brain naturally makes, and we have opioid receptors that our natural endorphins, our natural opioids interact with. And when the endorphin interacts with our opioid receptor, it gives us the runner's high, it helps reduce pain, it increases kind of pleasurable sensations. So you can see how when we ingest like a prescription like oxycodone that has opioid activity, how it can bind to our ready-made, our natural opioid receptors, and that's how it exerts its pain-relieving effects. Well, the same thing is happening with the cannabinoid system. And rather than endorphins, we call it endocannabinoid. And the endocannabinoid system is really made up of those cannabinoid receptors, of our endocannabinoids, our natural cannabis-like compounds in the brain, and then the enzymes that are responsible for both the production and the metabolism of endocannabinoids. The endocannabinoid system has been around for a really long time. It is in almost every animal alive on Earth. If you have a nervous system, part of how your nervous system operates is through the endocannabinoid signaling network. It's a complex and widespread brain signaling system that regulates a lot of different body areas, including memory and learning, mood and perception, appetite and feeding behavior, and regulation of pain and inflammation levels. And it's that last part that really plays the biggest role in our conversation today around cannabis for fibromyalgia pain. But I think it's important to understand just how broad of a system this is, just how many body systems the endocannabinoid system interacts with. It helps us to understand why a compound like THC can both reduce pain but also increase appetite. The other reason I put this in this timeline here was to show that even 4,000 years ago, Chinese medical scholars were documenting that cannabis reduced pain and inflammation. And in these same medical texts, they actually talk about how cannabis specifically was helpful for rheumatism, which is an old-fashioned term for fibromyalgia-like muscle pain and joint pain, kind of a arthritis fibromyalgia combo. That's what rheumatism is. So it's not new information that cannabis can help fibromyalgia pain. I think it's important now, though, that we're really starting to get the studies that show that. And we're really behind where we should be in the science because for so many years, the legal restrictions around cannabis made it very, very difficult to study. So let's break down the endocannabinoid system into its major players. Well, we've got two main endocannabinoids. That's our own cannabinoid molecules that our brain makes. They both have long, complicated chemical names that I can barely remember or pronounce. But the one that we know the most about also has this really other interesting name, and it was named originally anandamide. And ananda, which I'm hoping I'm saying correctly, is the Sanskrit word for bliss. So it's been deemed our kind of own internal bliss molecule. And interestingly, this cannabinoid that our brain makes is very similar to THC, which is the component in cannabis which causes the psychoactive effect. So it's been called our own internal THC molecule. So the endocannabinoid, we've got those, and then we've got cannabinoid receptors, and those exist both in the nervous system, in the brain, in the spinal cord, in the nerves. All throughout our whole nervous system, you'll find endocannabinoid receptors. And those primarily are the CB1, the cannabinoid 1 receptors. Then we have cannabinoid 2 or CB2 receptors, which are found primarily in the immune system. And finally, we have the phytocannabinoids, which are those chemical constituents within the cannabis plant, which act like a key that also fits into our cannabinoid locks. Both CB1 and CB2 have effects on pain. And we know that there are cannabinoid receptors and endocannabinoids in the pain circuit pathway all the way from our brain down the spinal cord into our peripheral nerves. Since CB1 is primarily in the nervous system, how it exerts its pain-relieving effects is by inhibiting or blocking some of the pain transmission, some of the pain signal transmission. And because CB2 is primarily found in immune cells, we see that when CB2 is activated, it has some anti-inflammatory effects, and that's how it actually acts to reduce pain. Of course, there's some overlap. There are some specialized immune cells, like mast cells and glial cells, that have both CB1 and CB2 receptors. But for the most part, CB1 is found in the nervous system, and when it's activated, you get some pain signal dampening. CB2, primarily in the immune system, when activated, you get the anti-inflammatory effects. So now we've covered the endocannabinoid system pretty well. We're going to dive into the phytocannabinoids, and the three that you've probably heard about are THC, CBD, and CBN. These are the three that we know the most about, and in particular, they're the ones that we think are primarily responsible for a lot of the medicinal effects of cannabis, in particular in regards to things like pain and sleep and anxiety. THC is certainly the most dramatic of these, and it's the one that's responsible for the psychoactivity or the high feeling. It interacts with both CB1 and CB2 receptors, and it is a pretty strong analgesic. But interestingly, while at lower doses, it has good pain-reducing or analgesic effects, at higher doses, sometimes it has this paradoxical effect of making pain worse. So it's definitely kind of dosage related, which is really important to keep in mind. THC is also responsible for some anti-inflammatory actions, and it is known to reduce muscle tension. CBD, or cannabidiol, is interesting in that it interacts with a wide range of receptors, but actually it doesn't directly interact with CB1 or CB2. It seems to have more indirect effects on those receptors. And another of its indirect effects is CBD actually boosts the levels of that anandamide, our internal THC component, and that may be how it exerts some of its pain-relieving effects. We know it's a strong anti-inflammatory, it has anticonvulsant, anti-seizure effects, and it's a mild pain reliever. It does not have any psychoactivity, and it is helpful because it modulates THC activity. What CBD does actually is it changes the shape of some of the THC receptors so that THC can't activate it as strongly. So what that means in, a real world sense is that if you are using a product that has CBD and THC together, you're going to get less of the kind of psychoactive or the negative effects of THC because it's balanced out somewhat by the CBD. CBN is a newer player, and I like to call it CBN is for nighttime. So CBN is actually a very sedating cannabinoid. It's a byproduct of THC, and it's made as THC sort of breaks down. So the older, like if you have a cannabis plant that's, dried and it's sitting around, the longer it's sitting around, the more CBN content it has and the less THC content it has. We know that it interacts with both CB1 and CB2 receptors. It is, in addition to its sedating properties, it has some mild muscle relaxant effects and some analgesic effects. It's also known to have some mild psychoactivity, and I can personally attest to this. So I like to drink CBD beverages, and they don't have any THC in them. And recently I tried one that had CBD and CBN in kind of high amounts. And actually, after I drank it, I was like, gosh, was there THC in that? I almost had that feeling. And then I remembered oh, right, it's the CBN component. So I can vouch for it does have a little bit of mild psychoactivity. Okay, we've covered the endocannabinoids, we've covered the phytocannabinoids, and the last little group here are the synthetic cannabinoids. And there's two prescriptions that are basically synthetic THC. And they've been looked at for lots of different pain conditions and other things, but there have been a few studies looking at them for fibromyalgia pain. They were effective, but had a lot of side effects. And this is a pretty consistent story, what we see across all of the studies looking at these synthetic cannabinoids. They have a lot of side effects, and a lot of people don't tolerate them. And there's thought to be kind of two reasons behind this. One, the synthetic THC compounds actually have a much more activating effect on the cannabinoid receptors compared to the more mild effect from the natural THC compounds. So that's one reason. The other reason is because it's just isolated THC, it doesn't have any of the other phytocannabinoids that you might get when you're using a cannabis-based medication. So it doesn't have the balancing effect of CBD or the other kind of entourage effect where you get the full plant medicine experience from all the different chemicals that are in that plant. Okay, we're finally going to get into the studies on cannabis for fibromyalgia pain. And it's not until the past, 5-6 years really, where the legal restrictions around cannabis, at least in the US, have lightened to the point that we can really start doing this type of study. So I think we're going to see a lot more studies now going forward. But there's a couple different studies that are interesting in here. The one in the middle we'll start with, and this was just a one-time dose of inhaled cannabis. It was a vapor, a vape basically, and it was 3 different kind of THC to CBD proportions, and then they looked to see, over 3 hours, did people have reduced pain? Well, it turns out that actually in that just one-time 3-hour window, people had a mild pain relieving effect, but it wasn't huge. And this is typical, it's kind of what we see actually in other studies looking at cannabis for acute pain. It doesn't actually seem to be that great for acute pain. It's much better for chronic pain. And this is kind of the opposite story from opioids, which are really great for acute pain, not so great for chronic pain, we're learning, for reasons that everybody is very familiar with. The other 2 studies here are pretty similar, and they looked at people over a period of 6 months, and they looked at people that were using the whole plant or oil extract. They unfortunately didn't specify strains or the THC, CBD, or other cannabinoid percentages, but basically generally folks that were on cannabis and using the plant, so the whole plant, they did experience in this top study about 44% of people experienced significant pain reduction. And in this one on the bottom, most folks actually, it was a pretty high percentage of people had decreased pain intensity. And also they reported increased range of motion of their joints, which is pretty interesting. Okay, so this study, which was published in 2020, is where things start to get really interesting because this is a much more real-world study. In the other ones that I mentioned, and in most cannabis studies, when they're looking at cannabis for pain, what they do is they actually enroll people that are not taking any other pain medication, or they have people stop all their other pain medications and try cannabis instead. And so they have people, stop their Cymbalta, their Lyrica, their ibuprofen, their Vicodin, whatever they're taking. And in the real world, that's actually not what usually happens. When people are trying medical cannabis, they're usually adding it on to whatever else they're already doing. And so this study kind of replicated how people are actually using it. They also did something really great. They had standardized extracts, and we knew exactly what ratio and amount of THC and CBD to THC people were getting. So in the evenings, they got a high THC extract. In the mornings, they got a 1-to-1 CBD to THC extract. That means equal ratio CBD to THC. Makes sense, right? Because that CBD is going to limit or counteract some of the psychoactivity from THC. And typically that's not desirable during the daytime, not as big a deal while you're sleeping or at night. So this study found that over 1/3 of patients reported a significant reduction in pain. About half had improvements in mood. And what's really fascinating is that almost half of patients were able to either reduce or stop one of their other analgesic medications. So cannabis was able to replace, or at least replace partly, some of their other pain medications. And if you think about it, it's a pretty good exchange because a lot of medications we use for managing chronic pain have the potential for side effects. Ibuprofen can damage our kidneys and cause bleeding ulcers. And, we know the challenges around chronic opioid use as far as dependence and tolerance, and even the risk of addiction, which is low, but it's definitely there. So if cannabis could be used to replace some of those higher risk medications, I think it could have a huge role in how we manage fibromyalgia pain going forward. And this also was pretty well tolerated, just mild side effects. And it wasn't like they had a whole bunch of people that had to get out of the study because they were having so many side effects like you saw with the THC prescription medications. So just to finish this off here, I thought I'd talk about how cannabinoids actually have been looked at for all sorts of different pain conditions. And a systematic review that was published, I think in 2017, looked at 42 studies that had looked for any cannabis preparation for any type of pain. And what they found was that overall, the results for cannabis were favorable, that it had more effect on pain than placebo did. And that it was the strongest evidence for neuropathic or nerve pain. And interestingly, in these studies that looked at acute pain, like acute postoperative pain, again, no benefit. So cannabis, great for chronic pain, not so much for acute pain. Opposite story with opioids. So it's early days still, but I feel like research on cannabis for fibromyalgia is really going to explode over the next few years, particularly as more and more people have access to medical cannabis and as the restrictions around research lighten up and as we're able to really start studying it more. So what is the answer to the question I posed at the beginning? Is cannabis effective for fibromyalgia pain? Well, what many patients have told me, what Chinese medical scholars were writing 4,000 years ago, and what recent studies have shown us is the answer is yes. However, we still have some room to go, and I'll let John Oliver say it for me. If you want this drug with serious medical benefits to be taken seriously, how about adulting up the names a little bit? That way a sick old man doesn't have to ask for an ounce of rainbow diesel funkadelic harmony. Thank you so much for joining me. If you want to learn more about managing fibromyalgia pain with cannabis or lots of other things, check out my book, The Fibro Manual, and references are here. And remember, stay fierce.